Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. Welcome to our webinar titled Phase 4 Connectivity, Best Practices for Success. Next slide, please. I'd like to start off with a few logistical items. You will be able to download a copy of today's presentation from the CAQH.org website tomorrow. The slides aren't on there now, but they'll be available tomorrow. In addition, a copy of the slides and the webinar recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. We will save time at the end of today's program to respond to your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. Next slide. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information about the Phase 4 operating rule requirements with a focus on connectivity, as well as Phase 4 certification. We want to ensure your successful implementation of the operating rules, as well as certification, so we will be sharing some best practices, tips for success, as well as resources. And of course, we will have time at the end for Q&A. Next slide, please. And now let's get started with our first presenter, Core Director Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great, thank you, Jessica. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we do want to focus in specifically on Phase 4, but we do have 3 previous phases that we've already drafted operating rules for and that have been widely adopted by the industry. And really some of the impetus and drive behind this is because the operating rules focus on specific HIPAA standards and also non-HIPAA standards as well. But those transactions allow for a great deal of savings if providers adopt the HIPAA transactions with the operating rules. The industry can save a lot of money. And you see some of those quotes there below from the 2017 CAQH Index report. Each phase focused on a specific functionality or interaction that a provider has with a health plan. So in Phase 1, we focused on eligibility transaction. In Phase 2, we extended those operating rules on eligibility, as well as added operating rules for the claim status transaction. In Phase 3, we have requirements and operating rules for the EFT and the ERA transaction. Moving into Phase 4, we built operating rules around the healthcare claim transaction, both the professional, institutional, and dental transaction, as well as the prior authorization, the enrollment-disenrollment transaction, and the health plan premium payment transaction. This entire suite of operating rules supports the HIPAA-mandated transactions that trading partners should use, including health plan providers, between health plans, providers, clearinghouses, and software vendors. And that designation as the operating rule author allows us to draft operating rules for these transactions as well as future HIPAA-mandated transactions. On the next slide, we do want to walk into and get into some of the in-depth requirements for the operating rules for Phase 4. And what's unique about Phase 4 is that we focus the rules on our infrastructure requirements. Infrastructure requirements, you're asking yourself, what specifically are those? As opposed to data content, infrastructure focused on how you conduct that HIPAA transaction. What are the roles and responsibilities of the trading partners as they move that data from point A to point B? So focusing on the specific 4 transactions in Phase 4, the infrastructure requirements include processing mode, batch mode requirements, batch acknowledgements, real-time processing mode, response times, as well as real-time acknowledgements, safe harbor connectivity and security requirements, as well as system availability and the companion guide template. There are also some other specific unique requirements or operating rules for Phase 4. We'll walk through those in detail. But I want to draw your attention that they are specific to the conduct of the transaction and not to the data content. In Phase 2 and Phase 3, we do have data content rules related to specific transactions. And in future phases, we'll also look at and focus on data content for the other transactions. But for Phase 4, it's specific to the infrastructure requirements. And again, those roles and responsibilities between trading partners. Moving into the detail of Phase 4 batch requirements, this is a specific mode of conducting the transaction, and it ensures that, again, those roles and responsibilities between trading partners are known by everyone that's going to conduct the transaction. So if you're conducting this particular transaction, phase 4, let's say it's the 837, the claim transaction. If you're sending a batch of claims in from your provider and you send that batch of claims into your health plan every evening at 6 o'clock when you leave the office, you'll be ensured that you'll have acknowledgments ready for you the next morning. So it allows you to submit that batch, and within the next day by 7 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll have our batch of acknowledgments back in hand, so you know exactly that the batch was accepted, the individual claims were each accepted or rejected, and you could actually put in a business process to rework those claims and resubmit that batch if it failed, or look at those individual claim acknowledgments and rework those individual claims as well. So again, the intent of the operating rules is to ensure, again, those roles and responsibilities between the provider, the health plan, the clearinghouse, and the vendor are known. What's really important, too, for our batch mode processing is that they are related to each of the types of transactions, all 4 transactions. So the claim, the prior authorization, the premium payment, as well as the enrollment, disenrollment. Again, there are specific nuances for each type of those transactions as they're conducted in that phase or not. So, for example, the 278, you have the option to conduct that transaction in real time, in batch, or in both. Whereas the claim, the 834 and the 820, you're required to conduct those transactions in batch and meet those batch requirements for the operating rules. So it's important to see that distinction, how you implement, how you conduct that transaction. It's going to be specific to how those rules are going to be required of you and how you set up your systems and applications. Moving on to our real-time requirements. Just like batch, we do have specific real-time requirements if you choose to conduct these transactions in real time. You'll note here that there are no specific requirements to conduct these transactions in real time, but if you do have a system, an application, or software program that does conduct these transactions in real time, then the real-time requirements would be applicable. And that would include a 20-second round-trip response time requirement for all 4 transactions. So if you have a software application that allows for the prior authorization, the 278 transaction, to be conducted in real time, then you have to have that response back to the provider or the user of that system within 20 seconds. And that would include, for example, the 999, the acknowledgement that that transaction was received or rejected. Or you'll actually have the 278 response back within 20 seconds. So you have that type of requirement for real time. Either you get the response or you get the acknowledgement indicating exactly what transpired with that transaction. So again, the end user, most often the provider, knows exactly what to do, can set up a business process to have an interaction with that transaction. It was acknowledged and saved. So it was acknowledged and rejected because there was missing information. The provider can go back, rework that transaction, and resubmit it in real time. Moving on to the next slide, we also have very specific system availability requirements for entities that are implementing the Phase 4 operating rules. This establishes a specific amount of time that the system must be up and available to conduct business. Healthcare is delivered 24/7, 365. Systems need to be able to conduct these transactions at a minimum amount of time. We established that minimum amount of time at 86%. Per calendar week. So this allows entities to have system updates on a weekly basis. There are break-fix requirements. There are system turns that take place at health plans on a periodic basis. And this window allows them to have those types of system updates and enhancements go in on a periodic basis, but their training partners are aware of those. And it requires plans, software vendors, clearinghouses to publish when those downtimes occur. So you publish that regularly scheduled downtime calendar, provides 1 week advance notice for non-routine downtime. So let's say a health plan has every quarter they go down for 3 hours on a Sunday evening, but one particular week they have to put in a break fix, and they can schedule that 1 week in advance, let their training partners know that the system or application is going to be down. Their training partners are aware of that, and they can accommodate that. We also have a 1 hour provided information if there's an emergency downtime. Obviously, in an IT system or world, there could be emergency breaks, and emergency fixes have to go in as well. So this allows those systems and applications to get the repairs that they need, but also the trading partners are aware when that system is down. And these requirements are applicable for all 4 of the Phase 4 transactions. We also have requirements for a companion guide, and this is similar to the requirements in our previous 3 phases as well. So if you are a publisher of a companion guide for any of these transactions, and that would usually be a health plan, a clearinghouse, and a software vendor, these specific requirements require the publisher to publish a companion guide using the flow and format of a specific template, and that template's available free on our website. And it does have a specific flow so that the consumer of the companion guide, which is typically a clearinghouse or a software vendor, they have to draft their software and publish their software for every health plan or clearinghouse that they may interact with and conduct these transactions with. So those consumers really needed to have a tool to ensure that they can read the requirements for every health plan that they may conduct business with. And a shared template allows for that consumption to be much easier. So again, we do have these requirements for all 4 of the transactions in Phase 4. As mentioned earlier, we also have some specific requirements for Phase 4 that have not been included in any other previous phase. That's because of the unique type of transactions that are within Phase 4. Specifically for the healthcare claim, the receiver of the transaction, as defined by a HIPAA-covered provider or its agent, has to be able to process the 999 transaction. And they have to be able to process that transaction within 1 business day of receipt. This allows or ensures that the provider has the information that they need, that batch of claims or that individual claim has been rejected, perhaps, or rejected with errors. They can then moderate a business process, make corrections, and resubmit that all within 24 hours. So it's not waiting kind of weeks on end until the provider gets a remittance advice and then realizes that the batch was never received or the individual claim was never received. So this helps the revenue cycle for the providers, having those types of acknowledgments ready at hand within real time or within 24 hours. They can they can react to it and make a business process change to it. We also have requirements for health plans or other entities that process the benefit enrollment and maintenance transaction, as well as the premium payment transaction. And the requirement here is that they have to be able to process these transactions within 5 days of receipt of that data. This ensures that the membership files are updated timely, so the providers have information about the eligibility and benefits of those members. Right, if you have a member that has recently joined, a new employee, come onto a company, that membership file is sent to the insurance plan, the member goes to the provider needs to know what those benefits are in as quickly as amount of time as possible. So the benefit enrollment and maintenance transaction allows for that information to be shared with the provider, and the data requirements to process that within 5 business days of receipt ensures that the health plan is doing their job in ensuring that providers have access to the cleanest and clearest information possible. This is also related to the premium payment as well. We want to make sure that the payment has been processed, the data around that payment is processed in a timely manner as well. With that, we'll move into the more technical part of the presentation where we talk about the connectivity requirements related to Phase 4. And the connectivity requirements, we have actually made several enhancements to what we've had in Phase 2. And some of those technical improvements include adding implementator feedback to improve the clarity of the rule wording. In Phase 2, when it was initially drafted a few years back, we've had much industry implementation of the Phase 2 connectivity and lots of feedback from those implementers. So we're able to take that feedback and make changes, many of them necessary, for more clarity around the requirements for Phase 4. We've also increased the network transport security in Phase 4. We'll get into some of the details of that in just a moment. We've also separated the payload and processing mode documentation. So how we document the requirements has changed from Phase 2 to Phase 4. This allows us to have an easier maintenance process and a way for the industry to adopt those changes on a more periodic basis. We've also simplified the interoperability. We've converged onto a single envelope message structure and also a single authentication standard. So going from 2 of each in phase 2, we've now gone to one for each, both the message envelope standard as well as the authentication standard, just a single one. Again, more details in just a moment. We've also included additional message interactions to conduct additional transactions. So you'll see in the phase 4 documentation that we've included other X12 transactions and non-X12 transactions in our documentation that are not specific just to phase 4 transactions. For example, you'll see requirements for the 275 transactions to support attachments. We have no requirements to do that, but you'll have the necessary structure, and the interactions and the mappings are all available, and again, available for free on our website, to show how these other X12 transactions can still be conducted using this connectivity method. So it allows for really some progress to be made by the industry, even if there isn't a requirement to conduct that transaction through HIPAA or legislation today. But it has built that framework for the industry to move forward now, rather than waiting for that mandatory requirements to come out. We've also had transaction support. We've added the specific transaction for phase 4, again, the claims, premium payment, enrollment, and the prior authorization transactions to be included. We've also extended our safe harbor for these transactions as well. So more information on our safe harbor is also really important, because we do extend this from our previous phases into this phase as well. And remember that the safe harbor allows for trading partners to always have, at a bare minimum, one way, at least one way, to conduct the transactions. So if a provider, a clearinghouse, a software vendor wishes to set up a process to conduct this transaction with a health plan, the health plan has to be able to support the phase 2 or the phase 4 method to conduct those transactions at a minimum. There could be many other ways of conducting those transactions, and those many other ways, like a FTP or SFTP, those can still be in place. They do not have to be unplugged. Those can be maintained ad infinitum. The rule, this requirement around safe harbor, just ensures that there's at least one way that the provider, the health plan, and the clearinghouse can conduct the transactions uniformly. We have also, as mentioned, focused a lot of our effort and discussion in phase 4 on the specific security requirements. This is related to submitter authentication as well as the transport security. Submitter authentication, we do now require in phase 4 a digital certificate over SSL or TLS. We have sunset the requirement for username and password. It would still be required for phase 2 transactions, but not for phase 4. And this is, again, progressive use of more stringent requirements for submitter authentication as the industry has moved forward with these in many other ways, particularly in the clinical side of the world. We've adopted that here on the administrative side as well. This also includes specific requirements around transport security. There are specific versions of the SSL, version 3. TLS also requires 1.1 or higher requirements. Again, this is to support many of the things that have gone on the clinical side of the house or within the industry, and we're ensuring that we are maintaining that same high levels of security on the administrative side of the house as well. Again, very specific requirements related to authentication and security requirements. If you have any questions, just let us know. We do have a little more detail on the next slide for the digital certificate single authentication benefits. This is, again, to ensure that as we as an industry really focus on the administrative side on security, similar to the way that our colleagues have done on the clinical side, moving to the single standard really helps reduce the implementation costs and complexity that plans have, as well as clearinghouses, software vendors, and providers. It does allow a much stronger security, a much stronger level of security than simply a username and password. It also allows for that public key, that key certificate to be used, and those digital certificates, they expire on a periodic basis and they have to be renewed. So you can't get stuck using the same username and password for years as many plans have or many clearinghouses software vendors have. And that really increases the chance for risk for people to break through that password and log in, whereas an automated expiration for digital certificates and the way to log and track digital certificates is much more automated and much more secure. So again, much of this was related to aligning this side of the house on the administrative side of the business with the clinical infrastructure that have taken place. Hopefully, as you've seen, the specific requirements that we have for phase 4 related to these 4 transactions, the claim, the prior authorization, the premium payment, and the enrollment-disenrollment transaction have many unique benefits related to them. Obviously, particularly with prior authorization and claims, you can really enhance the revenue cycle management process because you're simplifying the way that the provider interacts with the health plan. The provider now knows much more timely when a batch of claims was not received or if an individual claim was rejected. They can then put in processes in place to work those claims up front rather than waiting for the remittance advice to come out 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 30 days later before they realize that specific claims have not been processed. It helps reduce staff time because, again, you're receiving automated responses back on your transactions. They won't have to pick up the phone. They won't have to fax an inquiry in. They won't have to fax a prior authorization because there's now an infrastructure that supports prior authorization. Plans and clearinghouses, software vendors can develop products and applications to support the automation of the sending and the receiving of the prior authorization and the claim information. Again, it also helps alleviate delays and errors in processing employee change life events. As mentioned earlier with the enrollment-disenrollment transaction, having specific requirements around how that data has to be processed and how timely that data has to be processed can simplify and expedite the process of that information. So providers have better access, quicker access to that information as they service their members. With that, I'll hand the call over to Taha Anjarwala, a manager at CAQH, to walk through our Phase 4 core certification. Taha?
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for providing us a great detail and overview of the technical requirements for Phase 4. And today I'll be walking everyone through the process and kind of benefits as to why your organization should pursue Phase 4 certification. So on the next slide, as a program, core certification really stands out as the industry gold standard on how a certification program should be developed and administered. And the slide kind of outlines all the elements that make the certification program stand out. From an industry perspective, the elements of the certification program, which are the actual requirements necessary for organizations to demonstrate and test conformance with the operating rules, were developed by a multi-stakeholder group of industry representatives through a transparent process. And these certification requirements were put through the same thorough, rigorous, and review voting process that the core operating rules had gone through. So core certification is the industry deciding for itself what conformance to the operating rules actually mean. Another great benefit of the certification program is that each phase builds off another. So as you implement and certify for one phase of the operating rules, you can actually leverage your past efforts to implement and certify future phases. So if you've already gone through core certification for phases 1, 2, or 3, phase 4, you can already leverage some of the key infrastructure you've built and supported for the previous transactions to help you certify for phase 4. And lastly, another key benefit we hear from organizations as to why they pursue certification is to assure conformance with the rules and standards, as the value of the core seal gives confidence to organizations that they have gone through a comprehensive, industry-driven, and non-biased and independent process to assure adherence to operating rules and the underlying standards. So on the next slide, the core operating rules promote seamless electronic sharing of large quantities of administrative data across our nation's healthcare system quickly, cost-effectively, and accurately. Widespread adoption of these operating rules is critical to ensure these benefits are realized across the industry. And as a way to drive and track market adoption and adherence to operating rules and standards, the core certification program serves as this vehicle. And looking at the impact of core certification has on the nation's healthcare system and measuring the amount of covered lives that benefit via core certification. 76% of the commercially insured and 44% of publicly insured lives are covered by a core certified health plan for phases 1 to 2. And for phase 3, we see adoption is growing, with 27% of the commercially insured and 25% of publicly insured covered by certified plans. And we're actually in the process of updating this market share data to reflect 2018 numbers and also adding phase 4. So over the next month or two, we'll have that update for you. And this data reflects the momentum of certifications in the industry and the increased commitment and collaboration of stakeholders in healthcare to effectively share electronic data in secure and meaningful ways. And I'd like to call out some of the most that we've awarded 341 core seals to date, and some of the most phase 4 core certified organizations include Humana, PocketDoc, WorkComp EDI, and Texas Medicaid. So congratulations to these pioneers. So moving into the next slide, core certification testing is an important component of the certification process, as this step will kind of help you verify your IT systems and business processes are conforming to the requirements of the operating rules and standards they support. To complete testing, organizations must utilize CAQH core test suites in order to maintain consistent and uniform test results. Core certified entities should work with the core authorized testing vendor to perform tests based on testing criteria specific to your stakeholder type. And organizations will have to complete a variety of different test scripts, and they're categorized into 3 main buckets. The first bucket is signed attestations, where organizations will have to attest to conforming with certain rule requirements and adherence to standards. The second bucket is document uploads. Well, you'll have to actually upload, companion guides, audit logs to ensure that you comply with the real-time requirements or batch requirements, and transaction testing, which we'll actually dive in a little bit detail, and actually you'll have to establish connectivity and exchange acknowledgements and transactions to test adherence to some of those key infrastructure requirements. This slide provides an overview of the Phase 4 core certification testing portal, which is designed to build off the user and testing experience from past phases. Testing is conducted by an authorized testing vendor and helps organizations validate their conformance to Phase 4 requirements. Each phase of the operating rules share a common set of infrastructure requirements that Bob talked about a little bit earlier, and that apply across each transaction, including requirements around connectivity and security, response time, system availability, companion guides, and acknowledgements. Thus, if you implement one phase, you've already created that foundation that will help streamline implementation across remaining phases. And we'll hear more about details and challenges and also best practices for Phase 4 testing later on today. So on the next slide, as you can see, we've mapped out the best path approach your organization can take when implementing and certifying on the Phase 4 operating rules. This approach starts with an assessment and reading of the operating rules themselves, followed by engagement of internal resources to kind of kick off and start your project. Next, we would recommend to use our analysis and planning guides to map out any sort of gaps and identify any remediation strategies by either working internally or with your training partners. We actually have these gap analysis planning guides available on our website for free, and I'll talk about some of those kind of key essential resources to help support certification later on in today's webinar. After your systems have been remediated, the next step should be to pursue certification. That way, your organizations can assure, validate, and showcase efforts with operating rule implementation. The certification process includes submitting a pledge to demonstrate your commitment to certification, followed by certification testing to ensure your systems conform with operating rules, and lastly, application for the core seal. And on average, most organizations are able to complete this process within 3 to 6 months. Core staff are available to help you navigate through each step of your implementation and certification journey. So moving on to the next slide, CAQH Core has worked to build industry awareness of its core certification enforcement policy. This is due to a large footprint of core certified entities now in the marketplace, and that organizations across the data exchange should be seeing the benefits afforded by the operating rules, and we want to ensure there's ongoing monitoring of compliance in the industry by all trading partners. As a component of core certification, the enforcement policy has always existed, and core certified entities must adhere to the policies in addition to operating rule and testing requirements in order to become core certified. The enforcement policy applies to any core certified entity, including certified health plans, vendors, clearinghouses, and providers, and touches all phases of the operating rules dependent on which your organization is certified on. To help organizations orient and navigate themselves through the certification enforcement process, we have created a webpage with tools and resources to help you with engaging in enforcement. As an example, if you believe one of your training partners is non-compliant with the operating rules, we have a letter template available to help you start a collaborative dialogue with the training partner in order to help facilitate remediation efforts. Beyond core certification enforcement, the Department of Health and Human Services has also increased its activity around enforcement through complaints received via its asset tool and launch of the HHS optimization project pilot. And this pilot program checks for compliance with adopted standards, operating rules, code sets, and unique identifiers. So in light of the federal enforcement activities, certification, testing, and issuance of a core seal helps give organizations assurance that they are complying and conforming with federally mandated operating rules and standards, and also allows organizations to feel more confident in the event of an audit. Essentially, it's like using TurboTax or going to H&R Block or a third-party accountant to help you file and submit your taxes. It's a good practice to find somebody outside of your organization to check your work to make sure you did it right. And core certification is that kind of check and balance for operating rules and underlying standards. Certification helps organizations prepare for those potential compliance reviews and audits through its comprehensive testing and application and review process. So core certification is positioned to help organizations assess and validate operating rules and standard implementations in preparation for potential audits by the government. And I think that ends my portion, and I'll turn it over to Jessica for the polling question.
Thank you so much, Taha and Bob. So let's go ahead and launch this polling question. I know that we have just walked you through a lot of information on the requirements and as well as on the value of core certification. But we want to make ourselves available for consultation with you if you think that would be helpful. If you have any questions about what we've just discussed, if you want access to resources, or you just want to understand why this is something that your organization should pursue, please click yes, and we will contact you and schedule a consultation. And if you're not sure, if you click unsure, we're going to contact you as well. So might as well click yes. So I'm going to give this just a few more seconds, and then we won't share this information, but for those of you who clicked yes and unsure, we'll follow up with you and schedule a consultation. So let's go ahead and close the poll. Thank you so much for your response. And then we'll move on to the next segment. So what we've done for this next segment is when we see a certain pattern of certain questions that come up, we want to walk through those with you and hopefully give you some tips and some best practices so that when you encounter these types of challenges, you know what to do. So let's go on to the next slide. So the 509 certificate is something that Bob just walked you through, and it is something that we get several questions about. So let's go through the first challenge. So I'm testing for phase 4. How is that different from past phases?
Yes, great question, and one that we've received from many of our implementers for the core operating roles. Because many of the health plans, software vendors, and clearinghouses have kind of been with us through this journey. They've implemented phase 1, they've implemented phase 2 and 3, and now they're considering phase 4. And so understanding those differences are really key. We have some tools, as Taha mentioned, and we'll talk about those resources a little bit later as well. But really generally, phase 1 really started with that core safe harbor, as I mentioned. So it allows for one way for the transactions to be conducted between a health plan and a provider. The provider has one safe harbor. They can always set their ship there to make sure that the transactions can get to the health plan. It also established some really basic fundamental requirements around conducting the transactions through HTTPS, over the public internet. So it allows for the public internet to be used to conduct the transactions. And also some basic requirements around username and password. So kind of really basic, foundational, fundamental, a big sea change in the industry in actuality, but it's been a few years. And after we implemented that for phase one, it was just the eligibility transaction. The industry really jumped on board and said we need to look at connectivity and security in a broader way and look at other transactions and kind of implement that for all of the HIPAA transactions. So the core body, all the core participants came together as we launched phase two and phase three, as we broadened the scope of what these rules really mean for connectivity and security for the other transactions. So we've added in phase two and in phase three, well, we've continued that safe harbor. There's still a way to conduct the transactions for providers. They have that one way to do it. That one way still relies on the public internet. And although in phase two, there are two requirements or two ways of doing that through MIME multipart or SOAP WSDL, nearly universally, I think everyone that went through phase two certification all certified on SOAP except for one entity. And this was at the time in 2008, 2010, wow, it's been a long time ago, that really there was a divide within the industry to use both methods, but through actuality, through true adoption, most of the industry adopted SOAP WSDL. And not just for healthcare transactions, but for all types of transactions in the internet. So there was this kind of coalescence around SOAP WSDL at that time, and you'll see that as we carry that through into phase four. So phase four only requires SOAP WSDL to be used. Back in phase two and three, we also had the username and password and digital certificates. At that time in 2006, 2008, 2010, when many of these rules were developed, digital certificates were new. They were much more complicated. Not everyone wanted to adopt them. So the industry chose both methods, username, password, and allowed for digital certificates. And then through the development of phase four, really the industry has all moved towards digital certificates. And so we've dropped that requirement for username, password here in phase four. An important question that we already have come in from one of our submitters is that what are we going to do as an industry to go back and look at phase two and make potential changes? That's a great question because for those transactions for phases two and three, we probably should meet as an industry and look at and adopting just SOAP WSDL and just digital certificates for those transactions. So it's definitely going to be a future phase for CORE, going back and looking at our previous transactions and our previous requirements and really modernizing them and making sure that they're up to speed and up to date with current connectivity methods and current certificate methods and security requirements. So great question, thanks for the input. But it's definitely something that, as you can see, we've been doing every phase along the way, and we'll continue to do that in the future phases.
So Bob, you really sold me on this digital certificate, but my company doesn't have one. How do I get it? Who do I talk to?
So great question. So digital certificates may be issued by trusted third parties, essentially because they're very secure and there are lots of security requirements on that. And those third parties are called certificate authorities. And a couple of organizations, just to name them out, include VeriSign or Entrust. Or you can also try to obtain certificates from an organization you maybe have an established connectivity with if you're outsourcing kind of your requirements. As far as guidance from CAQH Core on who sort of restrictions and kind of who you should go to and the use of certificate authorities, we don't currently have guidance on this at this time, as certificates used for authentication can be issued by an organization that's receiving connections or a third-party certificate authority. So we leave it up to you to kind of make those decisions internally to be what's ever best for your internal security systems. And if you're unsure on how to obtain a digital certificate or kind of even where to begin the conversation or even how to apply for one, I would recommend contacting maybe somebody from your information security, IT, or maybe network departments within your organizations. And alternatively, if you outsource the processing of transactions, maybe the best bet would be to engage with your clearinghouse or vendor.
Thanks, Taha. So now I've got a certificate, but how do I use it to establish a connection in order to start certification testing?
It's another great question, one that we get quite a bit as well. Since digital certificates were relatively new when the rule came out, and a lot of folks have not fully implemented them universally through their systems, especially on the administration side. You can see here, we don't want to get into a lot of detail, but once you've obtained your digital certificate, and again, as Taha mentioned, we don't have specific requirements around how you do that. Many entities have their own process and to do this, and we allow you to make the best business decision for your organization. But once you have that, as you can see in our little simple diagram here between the client and the server, you've obtained your trusted certificate, and now how you act and conduct that transaction will determine how you are going to utilize that certificate. So if you're a provider, you're usually considered a client, you're sending in a request for information, the health plan is serving up that information, so they'll have the data to send back to the provider. Like an eligibility inquiry, you send in the eligibility inquiry, it has a few handfuls of data in it, you're requesting specific benefit information on a member. The health plan has an entire database about that particular member and all the benefits for that member. They're going to serve that information up to you as the provider, so you have it. You have the copay, the co-insurance, the deductibles, all that data will be made available to you. So as you're conducting that transaction, that digital certificate allows for that trust to be ensured between the two different systems or applications that are communicating to each other. And that really allows you to obtain that data because you're unlocking the secure padlock that the health plan has on that data.
So now that you've walked me through how to get a certificate and what to do in order to start testing, how do I begin the actual phase 4 testing?
Great question. We do have several links in the PowerPoint as well as on our website, and lots of information, more resources that we'll talk about in just a minute. But basically, you have to kind of set up a profile page. And you do that by clicking a link, and we have a specific vendor that we use, a core authorized testing vendor. Currently, it's EdFX, and they've done a great job with ensuring that the usability of their site is really easy. You can access the testing portal by clicking the link here, or again, anywhere on our website. We have these posted all over the place. And you will request that information to be set up your profile to create your account. Basically, they need your email address. And within 1 to 2 days, they'll send you a link where you can set up your own specific profile. And that profile is a smart profile. You can't see my air quotes, but it allows you to designate your stakeholder type, how you conduct the transactions. Are you a sender or a receiver? Do you only do batch? Do you do real time? And we'll populate that profile with a specific set of test scripts that match your profile type. So if you're a clearinghouse, you get 80 different scripts. If you're a health plan, you might get 120. But it's unique in the way that you conduct the transactions, real-time batch, which transactions you conduct, maybe you don't do the premium payment. So it's really kind of a smart interface, and it allows you to customize how you conduct the transactions.
So what's the next step in testing after I've logged in?
So there are a number of testing tests that will test your ability to kind of transmit your system's ability to transport and communicate transactions covered by Phase 4. For example, the 278, 837, 820, and 834 transactions using the Phase 4 connectivity method. And as you know, after you've established connectivity and that's been authenticated by the core authorized testing vendor, you'll actually be ready to begin transaction testing. And actually, to start this testing, the EdFX has actually developed a testing wizard to help you kind of guide you and navigate through that connectivity establishment process. You'll need to click Retrieve Response as highlighted in the slide, which will then start kind of the connectivity testing wizard. And this test wizard will actually confirm the connection URL and parameter information will help retrieve responses from a transaction inquiry from your server. And once those responses are downloaded by the testing vendor, the core testing system will verify that the responses are retrieved and appropriate for the testing task you're about to test for. So in looking at kind of sort of the transaction responses that you're actually testing for, you know, the bulk of the transactions testing is your system and the capability you're going to have is the return of positive and negative acknowledgements. Again, as the Phase 4 rule requirements are very infrastructure-based. We're not testing the data content, but your ability to kind of respond back to the successful receipt of the transaction. So essentially, once that connectivity is established and you're exchanging the connection back and forth between edFX, we're actually testing your ability to for edFX will be, in the case you're a health plan, edFX will be the provider, and then the ability for you to then send the acknowledgement back to the provider. So that's essentially what the testing task is actually testing for you. And there are a couple of ways to know if you've actually successfully completed, or if you failed to test. So if you look at the test results section of each testing task that's highlighted on the slide, you'll actually get a communication of your status after you've gone through the testing process. So if you pass the test results section will show as passed, and this means you've completed testing successfully, and you can move on to the next task. But what happens if you fail? And think of certification testing and the testing portal as an open book test. You can retake the test as many times, so that way, don't feel frustrated. The test is designed to help you identify sort of gaps and then apply some remediation efforts. So if you fail, you'll get a notice that you failed the test, and there'll be a hyperlink that will then generate a summary report for you. And within the hyperlink, you'll get to see kind of the different dynamics and verify information that you submitted, such as the connectivity information, and also any sort of error codes that might have generated from the failure of the transaction. So you can actually use these error codes to diagnose and troubleshoot problems within your systems to help you support your remediation efforts.
So I still have questions, but I'm not sure who to ask. Can you help me?
Sure. So on the slide, we've provided a really quick reference guide on who you can go to for questions and guidance around certain topics. And by going to kind of the designated organizations as your first point of contact accordingly. So for example, if you have questions on maybe operating rule interpretation and guidance, and you need some help with understanding, the impact of some rule requirements, feel free to reach out to CAQH since we're the author of operating rules. And by reaching out to that designated organization first, that probably will help expedite the response to your question and also ensure that you're receiving the appropriate answer. If you have questions on maybe certification testing, it may be best to coordinate with all three organizations, the testing vendor, CAQH Court, and your own internal organization. So that way, if everyone's copied on the same question, we can all help to resolve your effort, resolve any sort of implementation challenges in the most effective manner. So that way we're all communicating accordingly. All right, so I'd like to then now highlight some of the top FAQs and some of the general resources and implementation tools that we've provided to our organizations to help you not only with implementation of the operating rules, but also to guide you through the certification process. So on the next slide, you can see that we have a host of FAQs. We have several hundred. And these are questions that we receive from organizations that have gone through the implementation and certification process and have submitted questions via email or the phone and through the testing vendor. And as we see common theme trends and technical questions come through, we then turn these into FAQs. And these FAQs consist of real-world interpretation and assessments on the operating rules and certification process, which we've broken down on today's webinar. And we've developed that into a friendly question Q&A format where we can actually drill down on specific topics. And on our FAQ webpage of our site, we've actually even have a search feature, so you can type in some certain keywords that on issues or questions that you may have challenges with, and then that will help you find FAQs relevant to your search. And then also I'd like to highlight, since connectivity seems to be one of the biggest challenges for Phase 4 implementers and going through the testing process, we have a host of FAQs just on the topic of connectivity to help you guide through some of the technical implementations and guidance around that. And then on the next slide, a very important resource that I mentioned earlier as we were going through the certification process is our analysis and planning guides. So we actually offer these for every phase of the operating rules. We have one for phases 1, 2, 3, and we've also published one for phase 4. And these guides have separate tools within them. So not only can you do quick assessments where you can do simple checks of yes or no, identifying if a general operating rule applies, or is there a gap in my system, or do I need to engage with a trading partner? And additionally, the guides also offer drill down tools where you can actually check operating rule requirements line by line and determining whether or not those rules apply, looking at the business impact and also technical impact of any sort of remediation efforts that need to be made. And those remediation efforts can include from a variation of making software changes, business process changes, or maybe you may need to provide education or communications to other departments within your organizations, or possibly getting a trading partner on board with conforming to some of the operating rule requirements. This tool is really valuable and serves as a map that creates touch points between systems and business processes to help streamline implementation and remediation towards compliant operating rules. And then lastly, we've actually held a variety of webinars in the past that really focus on phase 4 certification and rule requirements. So I highly recommend, if you have any questions related to phase 4, feel free to refer back to any of our past content. And with that, you have the recording of the presentations and also the slides that go along with the webinars.
Thank you so much, Taha and Bob. And now we have some time for Q&A. I'd like to remind the audience to please submit your questions by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. We've received quite a bit of questions, so let's get started. So the first question is, as a tester within the EDIFX portal for phase 4, how do I configure my server with a payload ID?
Well, great question. I think the payload ID is generated randomly and uniquely by EDIFX, and it can be shared with you. So it's something that you can rely on EDIFX to help support you with. Also, if you are a client and depending on, again, the client-server relationship, depending on how you conduct the transactions, also depending upon the payload ID, you can also generate your own and share that with EDIFX, and they will update the particular test script with it. So it's not a significant problem or an issue.
Great. So the next question is, as a tester, how do I establish connectivity and how do I start testing?
Sure. So for establishing the connectivity, depending on which end of the spectrum you are, whether you're a provider or a health plan, and I'll start with the provider example. As a provider, a tester can actually get the testing URL from the testing tab itself that I kind of walked through earlier, and you must actually coordinate with EDIFX to get their XF 509 certificate, so that way you can establish a secure connection with them. And then, if you're a health plan, you actually need to share your connectivity URL and your 509 certificate with EDIFX, so that way they can configure their servers on their end to be able to establish connectivity and begin that transaction exchange.
Thank you, Taha. The next question is, where can I find the CAQH Core Companion Guide template?
Great question. The templates are available on our website, again, for free. There will be a link associated with each of the companion guide templates. We have it under each of the phases, but it's the same companion guide template because it's a template. So it is available on our website. So if you go to the website for any of the phases and look for the supporting documentation related to that phase, you'll see that with the core rule requirements. So you have the requirements, each of the rule documents, and the companion guide template is one of those documents associated with the rule itself. And if you want to send us that question through our email address, we can send you the link directly too.
Thanks, Bob. And that's helpful if we don't answer your question or you still have questions. That's another way to ask questions after the webinar, is send it to our email and we'll respond. We've received a couple of questions on WSDL and SOAP, and they're a little bit technical. So let's get started. So the first question is there WSDL for phase 4?
Yes, there is. There is a specific WSDL that's used for Phase 4 on creating the request, which is used to test for the Phase 4 transactions. Again, that WSDL, we also have that as a resource on our website. You can click on it and download the specific WSDL to help you actually build your own. We also have the specs for the WSDL in the connectivity guide as well that we've published with Phase 4. So we have both a hard copy you can look at online, it's a PDF, as well as an electronic version of it that you can download as well. We also have available, Medifex has made available to, as you test a claim or prior authorization transaction, a premium payment transaction, or an enrollment disenrollment transaction, there are also examples of those transactions as well. So if you have to have an inquiry for the 278 inquiry transaction, you can download that inquiry transaction as well. So there's lots of support and lots of resources, not just FAQs and questions, but actual examples of the transactions, examples of the WSDL, examples of exactly what it should look like. So we provide those for you as well as you build your own systems and applications, and as you work for actual certification testing too.
So the next question for Taha, can I course certify for Phase 4 if my organization uses some but not all the Phase 4 transactions?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. Very, very nuanced answer. So for vendors and clearinghouses, you can certify on the transactions that your product supports and offers. So if you're a vendor that does only claims and prior authorization, you're able to then create a testing profile with tasks just specific to those transactions. But if you're a health plan and you do all 4 transactions, claims, the prior authorization, enrollment, and premium payment, then we expect you to then become certified for all those transactions. The only exception for health plans is if you're more of a Medicaid or a commercial plan where you don't have the traditional enrollment, then there are certain exceptions that we do provide as far as those transactions being out of scope. But if you're kind of want to talk more in dialogue and to see what would be in scope and out of scope, we'd be happy to set some time with you to kind of walk you through your particular business case.
Thanks, Taha. And I think we have time for one more question. It's a little technical. Can I add additional SOAP headers?
That's a great question also, and one that we do get quite a bit because, again, the SOAP headers can be a little more dynamic. And so, yes, you can add additional elements within the SOAP header. Server entities that require the use of the additional SOAP header elements must define and really should define them in their companion guide so that your trading partners are aware that you're doing this and what those are and then how to read them. So again, that companion guide document is really, really important. So we've told you where the template's at, so make sure that if you are generating specific additional data elements within your SOAP headers, that those are specified so your trading partner community is aware of those. Again, it's usually specific to clients or servers. How your trading partner community may deal with those, you can work out through actual testing, right? Remember, the companion guide usually tells you not only what the data looks like and what the metadata looks like, it also usually defines how you, as a trading partner, should test your transactions before you go into a production environment. So that will also it should also be defined in your companion guide.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Taha. And I think with that, we are out of time. I want to thank you for joining us, and please email us at core@caqh.org if you'd like more information on Phase 4 or any of our other activities. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.